Hey, it's Nathan. I want to start today with a fact that changed how I look at people who are described as saints. Human hair grows about 1 centimeter a month, and it locks whatever is circulating in your blood into the keratin as it forms. That means a single strand is a recording. Cut it into segments, run each segment, and you can read a person's last year the way you'd read tree rings. Doctors use it. Poison control uses it. And in the story I'm about to tell you, a father used it, because he happened to be the one man in that county who knew what a strand of hair actually is. This is a story about a little girl who spent one night at her grandmother's house and came home unable to speak, and about a doctor who stopped an exam halfway through, went the color of the paper on the table, and said a sentence no parent ever wants to hear. It's also a story about how a town can love someone so hard for so long that nobody ever asks the obvious question. Stay with me, because the way this father finally proved it is the most beautiful piece of work I've ever put on this channel, and he did it with a $5 jar of powder. Oren Vickery made his living finding out what was making people sick. That was the plain way he put it when strangers asked, and it was accurate enough. He was a certified industrial hygienist, which is a title that means nothing to most people and everything to anyone who has ever worked a shift in a building that was quietly hurting them. Companies called him when a whole department started getting headaches at the same hour every afternoon. Lawyers called him when someone's lungs had gone bad and nobody could say why. Oren would show up with a hard case of sampling pumps, a roll of chain of custody seals, and a notebook, and he would spend 3 days doing the least glamorous work in the world. He wiped surfaces. He hung little plastic cassettes on people's collars. He measured airflow through a vent with a smoke tube and a stopwatch. He went home, and 2 weeks later a report landed on somebody's desk that said, in numbers nobody could argue with, exactly where the harm came from and how it got into a body. He had a saying he used with new clients, usually while he was crawling under a floor grate in a suit that cost less than his shoes. Everything that gets into a body leaves a roadmap, he'd say. The trick isn't being smart. The trick is knowing where to sample. He worked out of a converted feed store on the edge of Cortland Hollow, Indiana, a town of 4,000 people wedged into the seam between corn and limestone. The building still had the grain chute in the back wall and a smell in the floorboards that no amount of sealer would kill. He'd bought it cheap the year his daughter was born, because he wanted a business that could survive one bad year, and because his wife had loved the tall windows. His wife's name was Bree. She had been a Sackville, which in Cortland Hollow was not a last name so much as a weather system. The Sackvilles had been there since the grain elevator went up in 1904. There was a Sackville on the town seal. There was a Sackville wing at the library. And there was Loretta Sackville, Bree's mother, who at 63 was the most loved human being within 40 miles, and it wasn't close. Loretta ran Sackville House, a 6-bed respite home for medically fragile children in a white clapboard Victorian on Kell Street, with a wraparound porch and a hand-painted sign in bottle green. Parents whose kids needed a feeding tube or a ventilator, or just a nurse who wouldn't panic, could leave them there for a weekend and sleep for the first time in months. She'd been doing it for 31 years. She'd started it, the story went, after she lost her own boy. Lucian Sackville had died in 1997 at 9 years old, after 2 years of an illness that nobody had ever put a proper name to. Weakness. Pain in his feet so bad he'd scream when a bedsheet touched them. Then the silence. Then the hair. Then the end. The county had called it a rare degenerative neuropathy and moved on. Loretta had not moved on. She had turned her grief into a house, and then into a fund, the Copper Ribbon Fund, which every October filled the town square with a bake sale and a raffle and a banner that got a new number sewn onto it each year. 31 years. There were copper ribbon pins on half the lapels in Cortland Hollow. There was one on the mayor's coat and one on the sheriff's and one on the collar of the woman who ran the pharmacy. And there was one, always, on Loretta's cream blouse, right over her heart, catching the light when she leaned in to hug you. Bree had gotten sick at 31. It came on slow, over 3 years, the way you'd expect a family curse to arrive. Numbness in her hands, then in her feet. A tremor. Months where she was fine, and then a bad stretch, and then a worse one. Dr. Albin Pelham, the family physician, a soft-spoken man in a bow tie, who had cared for 3 generations of Sackvilles, wrote it up as the same idiopathic neuropathy that had taken Lucian. He used the phrase familial pattern in a letter, and after that everyone in Cortland Hollow said the Sackville illness the way you'd say the Sackville barn, like it was just a thing the family owned. Bree died at 34, 26 months before the night this story turns on. At the funeral, Loretta stood at the front of the Methodist church and told 200 people that God had asked her to give up a son and a daughter, and that she would keep the house open anyway, and half the town wept, and the other half wept harder. Oren didn't cry at the funeral. He sat with his daughter on his lap and stared at the pattern the light made on the floor, and afterward, in the church basement, his mother-in-law took his face in both her hands and said, "You'll let me keep her close, won't you?" He'd said yes. Of course he'd said yes. Mira Vickery was 7 that spring, and she was the kind of 7 that made adults act like better people around her. She had her mother's dark hair, which she wore in 2 low twists with red barrettes, because she had decided at 4 that red was correct and had never revisited the ruling. She wore a mustard yellow raincoat in every weather including none. She kept a running list in a spiral notebook titled Things That Are Actually True, which included entries like, "Moths are not just gray butterflies and Dad hums when he is worried and does not know it." She loved her grandmother. That's the part Oren would come back to later, at 3 in the morning, over and over, like touching a bruise to check it was still there. Mira loved going to Kell Street. She loved the wind chimes on the porch and the tin of butter cookies and the rocking chair and the way her grandmother called her lamb. And she loved the tonic. That's what Loretta called it, a tonic. Honey and lemon and something bitter underneath, warmed in a saucepan and poured into a heavy green mug that lived in the cupboard for that purpose. Every child who stayed on Kell Street got it at bedtime. It had been part of the house for 31 years, and there were grown adults in Cortland Hollow who still talked about that mug the way you talk about a smell from your childhood. Loretta would set it down and say the same line every time, in the same warm voice. "Drink it all, lamb. All the way to the bottom, or it doesn't work." The last week of April, Oren got a job he couldn't turn down. A powder coating shop 2 hours south in Terre Haute had 3 workers on the same line with the same symptoms and a workers' comp deposition scheduled for 8 in the morning. He needed to be on site the night before to run overnight sampling, and he needed someone to keep Mira. His usual sitter was in Louisville at her sister's. He stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand for a full minute before he called Kell Street, and he could never afterward explain why he hesitated, because at the time, there was nothing to hesitate about. Loretta picked up on the second ring, delighted, already planning. She'd make the good chicken. She'd let Mira stay up for 1 show, bring her by 5. He brought her by 5. He remembered the porch light was on, even though the sun was still up. He remembered Loretta coming down the steps in her marmalade cardigan with her arms already open, and the copper ribbon on her blouse throwing a little spark when she turned. He remembered Mira running the last 10 feet and being lifted, at 7, like she weighed nothing. He remembered the green mug already sitting on the windowsill by the sink, waiting, with a spoon in it. He kissed the top of his daughter's head. He said he'd be back by noon. Loretta walked him to the truck with a hand on his elbow the way she'd done since he was 24 years old, and terrified of her. And she said, "Go on, we'll be fine, we're always fine." He drove 2 hours south and spent the night in a powder coating shop with a light meter and a pump on his hip, and at 6 in the morning he found the answer he'd been hired to find, which was a cracked weld in a return duct that had been recirculating hexavalent chromium into a break room for 11 months. He wrote it up in the truck. He felt good. He remembers that clearly, and it makes him sick to this day. At 8:40 in the morning, in a gravel lot in Terre Haute, Oren Vickery felt good. He got to Kell Street at 11:20. Loretta met him at the door with a dish towel over her shoulder and told him Mira had had a rough night. "Bad dreams," she said. "Wouldn't settle. Might be coming down with something. There's a bug going around the 2nd grade." Mira was sitting on the bottom stair with her shoes already on and her raincoat already zipped, which was the first wrong thing, because Mira never had her shoes on. She was looking at the floor about 4 feet in front of her. Oren crouched down. "Hey, Bug," he said. She didn't look up. He said her name. He put a hand on her knee. She turned her face toward him, and her eyes tracked, and she knew him, He could see that she knew him, and her mouth moved slightly, the way a person's mouth moves when they are trying to lift something too heavy. Nothing came out. Behind him, Loretta said, "She's been like that since she woke up. She's just tired, aren't you, lamb?" Oren didn't answer her. He was looking at his daughter's hands. They were curled slightly in her lap, and the fingertips were pink and shiny, like she'd held them too close to a stove. He picked her up. She was 7, and she let him, which was the second wrong thing. In the truck he kept talking, filling the silence with the kind of nonsense that had made her laugh 1,000 times. Moths are not just gray butterflies, right? That's an established fact. She watched him. She didn't laugh. When they hit the county road, her hand came over and grabbed a fistful of his sleeve and held it, hard, the whole way home, and she didn't let go when he parked. He carried her inside and set her down in the hallway to get her coat off. The runner rug was there, the one Bree had bought at an estate sale, blue and rust with a fringe Mira used to comb with a fork. She took one step, and her right leg folded like it had been taken out from under her with a bat. He caught her before she hit the floorboards. She made a sound then, the first sound in 3 hours, and it wasn't a word. It was a thin, high noise pulled straight out of her chest, and her hands came up and grabbed at his shirt, and her eyes went enormous and locked on his, and Oren Vickery understood with absolute clarity, standing in his own hallway 20 minutes after coming home, that his daughter had just tried to stand up and discovered she could not. He got her to the couch. He got her socks off, because some part of his brain was already working the problem, and the soles of her feet were flushed a deep red, and when he touched the left one with 2 fingers, barely, the way you'd test a plate, she screamed. He was in the truck with her in 90 seconds. He did not call an ambulance, because the county ambulance ran out of Vernon and would have taken 22 minutes to reach him, and Belrose Children's in Indianapolis was 70 minutes away, and he knew both of those numbers cold, because he was a man who knew response times the way other men know batting averages. He called Loretta from the road, on speaker, because that is what you do. She said, "Oh, honey." She said, "Kids get these things." She said, "Don't drive angry." And then she said, in the same warm voice she used for everything, "Has she had anything to eat today?" Because she wouldn't take breakfast. And Oren said no, and Loretta said, "Well, that's it then. She's just run down." He hung up. In the passenger seat, his daughter had her forehead against the window and her jaw set, holding still, because she'd figured out that moving cost her something. He drove 86 miles an hour on State Road 46, and he hummed the entire way without knowing it. Belrose Children's Hospital took her back in 4 minutes, which is either very good or very bad depending on what you know about triage. The first hour was ordinary in a way that Oren found almost insulting. A resident with a tablet asked about fevers, tick bites, recent travel, new foods. A nurse named Vada Prue got an IV in on the first try and told Mira she had excellent veins, and Mira, who could not speak, gave her a small nod, and Vada said, "Thank you, I appreciate the feedback," and something in Oren's chest cracked slightly. They floated the word Guillain-Barré early, which is what you say when a child's legs stop working over a matter of hours. Ascending weakness, absent reflexes, recent illness. It fits. They ordered labs. They talked about a spinal tap in the morning. A resident used the phrase, "should improve on its own," and Oren, who had spent 18 years reading numbers for a living, heard a person guessing and dressing it up in a lab coat. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the pediatric neurologist came in. His name was Emeka Boateng, and he had come to Belrose 8 years earlier by way of a training post in Katowice, in southern Poland, and he was the kind of physician who does the whole exam even when he already thinks he knows. He was unhurried. He introduced himself to Mira first, and to Oren second. He warmed his hands on his own coat before he touched her. He checked her reflexes and found none. He checked strength, and found her arms nearly normal and her legs nearly gone. He asked Oren questions in a low, even voice. When exactly? What time did she wake? Was there vomiting? Was there any belly pain in the days before? Oren said she'd complained about her stomach twice in the last month, both times after a weekend at her grandmother's, and both times it had passed. Boateng wrote that down. He didn't react. Oren noticed that he didn't react, and filed it. Then Boateng took the sheet off Mira's feet and looked at them for a long moment, and asked her permission, and touched the top of her right foot with the back of one knuckle, and Mira flinched so hard the bed rail rattled. He said, very gently, "Does the blanket hurt, lamb?" He used that word by accident, because it's a word doctors use. Mira's chin crumpled and she nodded. Boateng stood up. He asked Vada to bring him a slide, a cover slip, and the scope from the resident room. Not a lab requisition, the scope. He said it the way a man asks for a wrench. He sat on the edge of the bed and told Mira he was going to take 4 hairs, and it would sting for exactly 1 second, and she could squeeze her father's hand as hard as she wanted, and she was allowed to be angry at him about it afterward. Then he took the 4 hairs with a quick pull from the crown of her head, roots and all, and laid them on the slide. He put the slide on the scope. He looked. Oren was watching his face, because he had spent his whole career watching faces at the exact moment a number came back, and he knew what it looks like when the number is worse than the person expected. Dr. Boateng did not gasp. He went still. He adjusted the focus a quarter turn and looked again, and then he sat back, and his hands came off the scope and rested flat on his knees, and the color went out of his face in a way Oren had only seen twice in his life, both times at industrial accidents, both times in men who had just realized they were looking at something they were going to have to testify about. He looked at Mira, then he looked at the door, then he looked at Oren. He said, "I need to stop the exam." Oren said, "What is it?" And Boateng said, quietly, "This isn't normal. This is not a disease." He stood and crossed to the door and closed it, which no one had done all day, and he stayed standing with his hand on the handle. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to ask you for 2 things and I'm not going to explain either one of them yet. Don't call anyone, and don't tell anyone where she is. Not family, not friends, no one." Oren said, "You're scaring me." "I know," Boateng said. "I'm calling someone." He left. Vadapru came in 11 minutes later and did not make eye contact and took blood in 3 tubes with purple tops and 2 he didn't recognize. And when Oren asked what the order was, for she said she wasn't able to answer that and she was sorry. And she was, visibly, sorry. 15 minutes after that, 3 people came through the door of the pediatric neurology unit at Belrose Children's Hospital, and 2 of them were uniformed Indianapolis police officers, and the 3rd was a woman in a rust corduroy blazer with a badge hanging on a chain and dark curls pinned back off her face. Oren stood up, because he thought they were there to help. The woman introduced herself as Detective Ophelia Ketchum. She said she was with the Crimes Against Children unit. She said she needed to speak with him somewhere else on the floor, and she said it pleasantly, and then one of the uniformed officers moved, not fast, not dramatically, just moved, and took up a position between Oren Vickery and his daughter's bed. And that was the moment Oren understood. They weren't there because someone had hurt Mira. They were there because someone had hurt Mira, and he was the man who had driven her in. The room they put him in had a window onto a courtyard and a box of tissues that had been placed, he noticed, within reach of the chair they wanted him to sit in. Detective Ketchum was good. He'd give her that forever afterward. She didn't accuse him of anything. She asked him to walk her through the last 72 hours, and then she asked him to walk her through it again starting from the other end, which is a technique, and he knew it was a technique, and he did it anyway because he had nothing to hide, and because every minute he spent in that room was a minute his daughter was alone. She asked what he did for a living. He told her. He watched it land. He watched a woman who was already suspicious of him become significantly more suspicious of him, and he understood exactly why. Because he'd have thought the same thing. A man who works with industrial chemicals. A man with a chain of custody stamp and a locked cabinet and a supplier account. A man whose wife had died young of a neurological illness nobody could name, and whose 7-year-old daughter had now presented with the same thing. Ketchum asked if he'd ever had access to heavy metals. Oren said, professionally, yes. Lead, chromium, cadmium, arsenic, mercury, beryllium. I don't stock them, I measure them. She wrote it down. She asked whether he and his wife had had life insurance. He said yes, a small policy, and it had paid out 4 years of a mortgage and a headstone, and she wrote that down too. Then she asked, and this is the question that told him what was actually happening, whether Mira had eaten or drunk anything he had personally prepared in the past 48 hours. He said no. He said he'd been in Terre Haute overnight. He said his daughter had been with her grandmother. Ketchum's pen stopped for a quarter second. Then it kept going. He was in that room for 2 hours and 10 minutes. When they let him out, a hospital social worker was waiting with a laminated card and a rehearsed sentence about a temporary safety plan, which is a phrase that means you are not going to be alone with your child. And Oren, who had been calm for 2 hours and 10 minutes, put his hand flat on the wall and breathed once, very deliberately, and said, "Fine, but she doesn't get left alone, and if you make her be alone in there, I will make a great deal of noise." They let him sit in the room with a nurse present. He sat there all night. Mira slept with her hand around 2 of his fingers. At 6:40 the next morning, Dr. Boateng came in with a printout and closed the door again and sat down and said, "I owe you an explanation, and I'm going to give it to you now, because the number came back." He put the page on the bed. Urine thallium, 411 micrograms per liter. Reference range, less than 5. Boateng said, "Your daughter has been poisoned with thallium, almost certainly repeatedly, and almost certainly over a period of months, with an acute dose in the last 36 hours. Oren looked at the number for a long time. In 18 years, he had signed his name under thousands of numbers. He had never had one do this to him. He said, "How did you know?" Before the labs. "How did you know from 4 hairs?" Boateng said, "Because I trained in Katowice, and in 2006 we had 11 cases in a single town, and my professor made me look at every one of them under a scope, until I could see it in my sleep." He touched the printout. Thallium leaves a black band in the root sheath of a growing hair, not the shaft, the root. You can see it in about 72 hours, long before anything else shows, long before the hair falls out. There is nothing else that does it. There is no disease that does it. If I see that band, someone put it there. He said, "That is why I asked you not to tell anyone where she is. Thallium in a child is not an accident. It is not in the water. It is not in the soil. It was banned as a rodenticide in this country before you were born. Someone with regular access to her has been putting it in something she eats or drinks. And I did not know, sitting in that room, whether that person was you." Oren said, "And now?" Boateng said, "Now I know she got the last dose in a house you were 2 hours away from, and I know you drove her here at 86 miles an hour, which the intake nurse noted, and I know you asked me 3 technical questions in a row that a poisoner would never ask because he wouldn't want the answers." He shrugged, tiredly. "I'm a neurologist. I'm allowed to have opinions. The detective is not." Then he said the thing that broke Oren in half. He said, "The belly pain your daughter had twice in the last month, both after weekends at her grandmother's. Sir, that's the dosing schedule." The word went out of Belrose and into Cortland Hollow the way water finds a crack. By Thursday, everyone in town knew that Oren Vickery was in a hospital in Indianapolis, and that the police were involved, and that it was, in the whispered word people used, deliberate. By Friday, everyone knew who they thought had done it. It wasn't complicated. Oren Vickery was not from there. He'd married a Sackville. He worked with chemicals in a locked building where nobody could see what he did. His wife had died, and now his little girl. There was a version of that sentence that made sense to people, and it had the enormous advantage of not requiring anyone in Cortland Hollow to think about anyone they loved. Loretta Sackville gave an interview to the Vernon County Register on a Saturday morning, sitting on the porch of Sackville House with a quilt over her knees. She did not accuse him. That was the craft of it. She said she was praying for her son-in-law. She said grief does terrible things to a man, and she of all people knew that. She said she had told the detectives everything she could, and that she had begged Oren for 2 years to let her be more involved, and that she blamed herself for not pushing harder. She said she had lost a son and a daughter to the family's illness, and she was not going to lose a granddaughter to anything, and that if the state needed someone to step forward, she was ready, and her house had 6 beds and 31 years. There was a photograph. She was wearing the copper ribbon. Somebody threw a brick through the front window of the feed store on Sunday night. Somebody spray-painted a word across the roll-up door on Monday. On Tuesday, 3 of Oren's 4 scheduled jobs canceled by email, all 3 citing scheduling, none of them meeting his eyes when he passed them in the world afterward. He moved into room 6 of the Ridgeway Motor Court on the highway, because he wasn't allowed unsupervised time with Mira, and because his house had become a place he couldn't be inside of. And then, on a Wednesday, sitting on a motel bed with a plastic cup of vending machine coffee going cold on the nightstand, Oren Vickery stopped being a father in freefall and became something considerably more dangerous, which was a professional with a grievance and a method. He got a legal pad. At the top he wrote a heading he had written on 400 reports: Exposure Reconstruction. Then, underneath, the 4 questions he asked on every single job, in the same order, because the order is the discipline. What is the agent? What is the route? What is the source? What is the dose over time? Agent: thallium, known, confirmed by lab. Route: almost certainly ingestion. Thallium salts are odorless, tasteless, and dissolve in water like sugar. That is precisely why they were the poison of choice for 80 years, and precisely why they were banned. If you wanted a child to take it, you would put it in something sweet, warm, and finished to the bottom. He sat with that one for a while. Source: unknown. Dose over time: unknown. And this was the whole thing, because dose over time is the only question that tells you where a person was standing when it happened. He drove to Indianapolis the next morning and asked Dr. Boateng for 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes he explained segmental hair analysis to a man who already knew it, because he needed Boateng to hear him say it out loud. Hair grows about 1 centimeter a month, Oren said. Whatever is in the blood goes into the shaft at the moment that centimeter forms. Cut a strand into 10 1-centimeter segments, digest each one separately, run each one on ICP-MS, and you don't get a number, you get a graph. You get 10 months, in order. Boateng said, "I'm aware." Oren said, "My daughter's hair is 31 centimeters long." There was a silence in that hallway that Oren would remember for the rest of his life. Boateng said, "That's 2.5 years. The hospital ran the segmental analysis." Oren, who was still a suspect and knew it, did not touch a single sample. He stood on the other side of a bench and watched a tech he'd never met cut, label, bag, and seal. And he asked her to photograph each seal, and she did, because she'd read the same procedures he had. 9 days later, Detective Ketchum called him and asked him to come to a conference room in the Vernon County Sheriff's Annex, and when he walked in, the graph was already taped to the wall. 28 bars, 28 months, running backward from the crown of a 7-year-old's head. For the first 11 bars, from the far left, nothing. Baseline, under 5. Then a bar, a small one, but out of nowhere, 3 times baseline. Then 2 flat months. Then another bar, taller. Then a rhythm. Bar, flat, bar. Bar, flat, bar. The bars getting taller as the graph moved right, marching across 2 years like a heartbeat on a monitor. And at the far right end, the last centimeter, a bar so tall the tech had to break the axis to fit it on the page. Ketchum said, "We cross-referenced it." She put a second sheet next to it. A calendar. Every date Mira Vickery had spent a night away from her own bed in 28 months, pulled from Oren's own invoices, his truck's mileage logs, his bank statements, and the sign-in book at Sackville House, which Loretta Sackville had handed over herself, helpfully, in a manila envelope, because she was cooperating fully. Every single bar landed on a Kell Street weekend. All of them. 22 out of 22. The 11 months of baseline at the beginning were the 11 months after Bree died, when Oren, drowning, had kept his daughter within arm's reach and had not let her sleep anywhere but her own room. Ketchum looked at the wall for a while. Then she said, without any particular expression, "Mr. Vickery, I'd like to apologize to you, and I'd like to do it later, because right now I want to talk about the last 411 micrograms." Oren said, "I want to talk about my wife." He drove home that night to a house he had not slept in for 6 weeks, and went into the closet in the back bedroom and got down a hat box that he had not opened since the week of the funeral. Inside it, in a plastic sleeve, was Bree's braid. She had cut it herself when the treatment started, before there were treatments, back when everyone still thought there might be something to treat. 31 years old, sitting on the edge of the tub with the kitchen scissors, making a joke about it so he wouldn't cry. 14 inches of dark hair with a rubber band on each end. He had kept it because he could not think of a single thing to do with it that did not feel like a crime. 14 inches. 35.5 centimeters. 35.5 months. He drove it to Warner Stallard himself. Stallard ran a trace metals lab in a business park outside Bloomington and had been Oren's mentor for a decade and a half, a wild-haired man of 68 who wore safety glasses pushed up on his forehead at all times, including at dinner, and who had once refused a $100,000 contract because the client asked him to round down. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then he took the sleeve, and he held it up to the light, and he said, "Son, if I run this, I run it under full chain of custody, split samples, and a blind duplicate to a second lab, because when this ends up in front of a jury, I want the other side to have absolutely nothing to say." It took 11 days. The graph came back in an email at 9:12 on a Tuesday night, and Oren opened it sitting in his truck in the motel parking lot, and he had to put his phone face down on the dash and get out and walk to the end of the lot and back before he could look at it again. 35 bars. Bree Vickery's last 3 years, in order. The first 6 months, low. Not zero, but low. Then it climbed. And it never came back down. It went up in steps. A plateau and a rise. A plateau and a rise. The way a dose goes up when someone is being patient. And the last 4 centimeters, the last 4 months of her life, were a wall. And under the graph, Warner Stallard had typed one line, because he was a scientist and would not editorialize in the body of a report, but the email was not the report. It wasn't a disease, Oren. Somebody spent 3 years doing this to her. Oren sat in his truck for a long time. Then he did what he always did when a number was worse than expected, which was to go get more numbers. He started with Lucian Sackville, dead in 1997 at 9 years old. The county death certificate, $40 from the recorder's office, said cause of death, respiratory failure secondary to progressive idiopathic polyneuropathy. Signed by a physician whose name Oren had seen on 100 documents in his marriage, Albin Pelham, M.D. There had been no autopsy. There had been no toxicology. The child had been sick for 2 years, and everyone had watched him die of the family illness, and a doctor in a bow tie had written the words down. Then Oren went to the newspaper archive at the Cortland Hollow Library, which is a microfilm reader in a basement, and a librarian who was, God bless her, 79 years old, and had no interest in local politics whatsoever. He read 31 years of the Copper Ribbon Fund. He was not looking for the fund. He was looking for photographs, because the fund put a photograph in the paper every October, and the photograph always had children in it, and Oren wanted names. He found Rena Otway on the 9th reel. She was 4 in the picture, in a wheelchair on the courthouse lawn, with Loretta Sackville's hand on her shoulder. The caption said, "Sackville House's littlest fighter." She was in the paper again, 14 months later, in a smaller item, with a much smaller photograph, and the word that Cortland Hollow used for children who died was past. And on the 11th reel, in a copper ribbon photograph from 6 years earlier, he found a teenage girl standing at the back of a group of children, holding onto a walker, glaring at the camera in a way that no other child in 31 years of those photographs had ever done. The caption gave her name, Sorrel Tennyson. She would be 22 now. It took Oren 40 minutes to find her, because she had not gone far. She was living in Seymour, 31 miles away, in a ground-floor apartment with a ramp, and when he knocked on the door and told her who he was and who his daughter was, Sorrel Tennyson stood in the doorway on 2 forearm canes and looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "It's the mug, isn't it?" Oren said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "The green mug, the tonic. She'd stand there and watch you drink it, all the way to the bottom, or it doesn't work." She backed her chair out of the way to let him in, and she said, "I've been telling people for 14 years that woman did something to me, and every single one of them told me I was confused because I was sick." Sorrel Tennyson had been 6 when her mother started leaving her at Sackville House on weekends, and 8 when she stopped being able to run, and 11 when a specialist in Louisville shrugged and used the word idiopathic, and 14 when she got angry enough to start writing things down. She had a notebook. She'd kept it for 14 years. It was not evidence of anything, legally, and she knew that, and she'd kept it anyway. She had written down that the tonic tasted different on the second night than the first. She had written down that Miss Loretta never made it in front of anybody. She had written down that when she'd once poured half of it into a fern, Miss Loretta had made her a fresh mug and sat on the end of the bed until it was gone, and had not been warm about it, and had said the word lamb in a way that Sorrel, at 9, had understood was not a nice word at all. And she had written down the thing that Oren had not thought to look for, because he was reconstructing an exposure and not a life. She had written down that it got worse when the fund was low. She had a list of Octobers. In the years when the copper ribbon banner went up and the bake sale did well, and there was a photograph in the paper, she had felt, in her words, ordinary bad. In the years when the paper ran the story on page 7 instead of page 1, she had spent the winter in bed. Oren sat in that apartment for 4 hours and came out with a shape he could finally see. It took investigator Ulysses Rooksby of the State Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit about 90 minutes to fill in the rest, because the rest was on paper, and paper is what his office does. Sackville House was a licensed 6-bed facility, and it billed the state for every bed day. There were 2 rates. The standard pediatric respite rate was $188 a day. The medically complex rate, for children requiring continuous skilled nursing intervention, was $561. The difference between those 2 numbers, across 6 beds, across 31 years, was not a rounding error. It was a house on Kell Street with a new roof every 8 years, a paid-off Buick, and an executive director's salary from a charitable foundation that never once in 3 decades filed a form the state bothered to look at twice. To bill at the medically complex rate, a child needed a physician's certification, renewed every 90 days. Every certification on file for the last 22 years had been signed by Alban Pelham, MD, and the co-signature, in the box marked administrator, on 940 of them, belonged to Montgomery Sackville, Monty, Bree's older brother, 41, golf polo, gold watch, a man who had never in his life had a job that wasn't his mother's. Rooksby laid it out flat on a table for Oren and Ketchum and did not dress it up. "She doesn't get paid for sick children," he said. "She gets paid 3 times as much for sick children, and she doesn't get to be Loretta Sackville unless children keep getting sick." Ketchum said, 31 years. Rooksby said, 31 years, and a banner, and a town that would rather burn a man's business down than think about it. Then Oren said the part he had been carrying since the microfilm room, and his voice was not steady. He said, "She killed her own son first, 1997. That's not a fund, and that's not a bed rate. There was no house yet. There was no fund yet. She poisoned a 9-year-old, and the whole town came and brought her casseroles and told her she was the strongest woman they'd ever met, and she found out what that felt like." The room was quiet. Rooksby said, "And everything since has been her keeping the feeling." They had a theory. What they did not have was a source, and without a source they had a coincidence with a graph on it. They also had 4 days, because on the following Monday, Loretta Sackville's attorney filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship of Oren Vickery in Vernon County Circuit Court, supported by a physician's affidavit from Alban Pelham, describing the minor child's hereditary neuropathic condition and the father's ongoing status as a person of interest in a criminal investigation. The judge assigned was Marcus Delcroix, who had known Loretta Sackville for 30 years and whose wife had chaired the copper ribbon raffle twice. Oren's attorney, a plain, unhurried woman named Imelda Cardiff, read the petition, put it down, and said, "We are going to lose this on paper. So we are not going to do it on paper. Here is what nobody in Cortland Hollow knew, and what Oren figured out on the second night in the motel with a legal pad and a highlighter, because it was the only question left. Thallium sulfate had been banned as a rodenticide in the United States in 1972. You cannot buy it. You cannot order it. A person under 70 could not casually obtain it in this country without leaving a trail so obvious that Rooksby would have found it in a morning. Which meant she hadn't obtained it. She'd inherited it. Westcott Sackville, Loretta's husband, dead since 1998, had run the Sackville grain elevator on the north edge of town from 1971 until it closed. Grain elevators had rats. Grain elevators in 1971 killed rats with thallium sulfate paste, sold in 1-pound tins with a skull on the label. And when the ban came, thousands of those tins across the Midwest did not get collected by anybody. They got put on a shelf in a locked shed with the other things nobody wanted to deal with. And then the man who locked the shed died. The elevator was still standing. It was still owned by the Sackville family trust. It had not been used for anything in 28 years except storage. Oren drove out there at dusk and stood on the county road 400 yards away with a pair of binoculars and looked at a corrugated shed with a hasp and a padlock on it, and he did not take one single step onto that property, because he was going to do this properly if it killed him. The woman who broke it open was 22 years old and had pink streaks in her ponytail. Lulu Havermeyer had worked the overnight shift at Sackville House for 19 months, which was longer than any aide had lasted in a decade. She had a phone full of photographs, because she had been trained at a nursing home to photograph every medlog page at end of shift after a colleague got blamed for someone else's error, and she had never stopped doing it, and Loretta had never noticed, because Loretta thought of Lulu as furniture. 19 months. Every medlog, every incident report, every time a child on the medically complex rate was, in Lulu's words, running around the yard just fine. And on a Tuesday in February, at 2:40 in the morning, Lulu Havermeyer had photographed a medlog page on the kitchen counter, and in the top left corner of that photograph, out of focus, on the pantry shelf behind a canister of flour, was a squat green tin with a torn paper label. Rooksby enhanced it. You could read 4 letters and a symbol. Leo, and a skull. Zelio paste. Thallium sulfate, 1%, manufactured in Kansas City, discontinued in 1973. Ketchum wanted a warrant that afternoon. Rooksby said no. He said, "If we hit that house and the tin is gone, we've got a photograph of a shelf. She's had 31 years to get careful, and she is the most careful person I have ever investigated. We need her to move it, and we need to be watching when she does." And Oren Vickery, who had spent 18 years figuring out how invisible things travel from a surface to a hand to a mouth, said, "I can do better than watching." He explained it standing at a whiteboard in a state office in Indianapolis to a room of people who had not asked for his opinion. He said, "In my job, when I need to prove to a plant manager that his gloves policy is theater, I don't lecture him. I dust a doorknob with a fluorescent tracer. It's a non-toxic powder, food grade, used for hand hygiene training in every hospital in the country. It is completely invisible in normal light. Then 8 hours later I turn off the lights, switch on a UV lamp, and I show him the inside of his own break room, his coffee pot, his phone, his sandwich, his face." He said, "People cannot feel it, and they cannot see it, and they cannot stop touching things." Then he said, "She is going to move that tin, and she is going to keep using what's in it, because she has a supervised visit and a home study, and she needs my daughter to look sick in front of a judge in 11 days. Rooksby said, "You want to tag the tin." Oren said, "I want to tag what's in it. I want you to take out what's in it, because it is a murder weapon, and it belongs in an evidence locker, and I want you to put back a food-grade white powder that looks exactly the same and does absolutely nothing, mixed 1-4 with tracer." Cardiff, from the corner, said quietly, and then she pours it herself, in front of a court-appointed supervisor, with her own hands. They watched the elevator shed for 6 nights. At 4:12 on the 7th morning, a Buick came up the gravel with its headlights off. A 63-year-old woman in a housecoat unlocked a padlock, went into a shed with a flashlight, and came out 90 seconds later with something in a canvas tote, and drove home, and the whole thing was recorded from 3 angles by a pole camera the state had installed under a warrant signed by a judge 2 counties over. She did not take it into the house. She put it in the trunk well of the Buick, under the spare, which is exactly what a careful person does. 2 nights later, while Loretta Sackville was at a church council meeting she had chaired for 19 years, a technician opened that trunk under a second warrant, removed a green tin containing 410 grams of a gray-white powder, photographed it, sealed it, weighed it, and put back an identical tin containing 410 grams of powdered dextrose and calcium carbonate, cut with a fluorescent tracer that fluoresces a hard violet under 365 nanometers and is used to teach nursing students to wash their hands. The supervised visit was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, in a family visitation room at the County Services Building, with a court-appointed supervisor named Diane and a camera in the corner that everyone was told about. Loretta arrived 11 minutes early with a canvas bag. She had baked. Of course she had baked. Oren Vickery was 7.5 by then. She had been on Prussian blue for 5 weeks, which is a bright blue powder that binds thallium in the gut and drags it out of the body, and which had turned everything about her life blue in ways she found both humiliating and hilarious. She was in a wheelchair because her legs were coming back, but they were coming back slowly. She had been speaking again for 9 days. Her father had not told her anything about a tracer. Her father had told her one thing, in the hallway, holding both her hands, which was that she never had to drink anything anybody gave her, ever again, for the rest of her life, and that this was not a rule for children, it was a rule for everyone, and that he was sorry it had taken him this long to say it out loud. Loretta was wonderful for 18 minutes. She was funny. She cried a little, at the right moment. She told Mira about a cardinal that had been coming to the feeder. She told Diane about the 6 beds and the 31 years. At the 21st minute, she took a thermos out of the canvas bag and unscrewed it and said, "I brought you your tonic, lamb. I know you've missed it." And she reached into the bag and took out the heavy green mug. She poured. The room smelled like honey and lemon. She set it down in front of a 7-year-old in a wheelchair, and she said the sentence she had said in that voice for 31 years. "Drink it all, lamb. All the way to the bottom, or it doesn't work." Oren Vickery looked at the mug. Then she looked at her grandmother, and she pushed the mug 6 inches across the table with 2 fingers, and in a voice that was still rough from 5 weeks of not being used, she said, "Grandma, you drink it." The hearing was the following Tuesday at 9. Judge Delcroix's courtroom was full, because Cortland Hollow had come. There were copper ribbons in that gallery. There were people who had thrown things at Oren Vickery's building sitting 6 feet behind him, and he did not turn around once. Loretta's attorney did an excellent job. He put up Pelham, who described a hereditary condition in careful language. He put up 2 mothers who wept and said Sackville House had saved their families. He put up 31 years, a photograph of a 9-year-old boy who died in 1997, and a woman in a marmalade cardigan with a copper ribbon over her heart, who dabbed her eyes at intervals and never once overplayed it. At 11:40, Imelda Cardiff stood up and said, "Your Honor, the father requests the court's indulgence for a demonstration lasting approximately 90 seconds. It requires the lights." Delcroix, who did not like it, said, "Counsel, this is not a television program." Cardiff said, "No, Your Honor. It's an industrial hygiene procedure. It has been performed several million times in hospitals in this country, and Investigator Rooksby of the Attorney General's office will lay the foundation." Rooksby laid the foundation in 4 minutes. A tin, a trunk, a warrant, a substitution, a tracer that is in the soap dispenser of every teaching hospital in America. Then the bailiff killed the courtroom lights, and 2 men from the state lab switched on a pair of UV lamps at the front of the gallery. Loretta Sackville's hands lit up like something out of a dream. Not a smudge, not a spot. Her palms, the webs between her fingers, the backs of both thumbs, a hard electric violet you could see from the last row. The cuff of the marmalade cardigan glowed. The clasp of her handbag glowed. When she brought her hands up to her face, which she did, because everyone does, there was a violet handprint on her jaw and violet across her mouth. The thermos on the evidence table glowed. The rim of the heavy green mug glowed all the way around, a perfect bright ring, because someone had held it and poured into it and pushed it across a table toward a child. And there was nothing on Oren Vickery, nothing on Mira, nothing on the court reporter, nothing on the judge's bench, nothing on Albin Pelham, nothing anywhere else in that room. 90 seconds. The lights came back on. Nobody in the gallery said a word, and Oren Vickery, who had waited 11 weeks for it, did not look at his mother-in-law at all. He looked at the room. He watched 200 people in copper ribbons look at their own hands in ordinary light and then look at hers, and he watched, one at a time, the exact moment each of them stopped being able to unsee it. Loretta Sackville was arrested in the parking lot of the Vernon County Courthouse at 12:20 in the afternoon, in front of the bandstand where the banner went up every October. She was charged, eventually, with the attempted murder of Mira Vickery, the murder of Bree Vickery, the murder of Lucian Sackville, the murder of Rena Otway, and aggravated battery against Sorrel Tennyson, and 4 other former residents of Sackville House whose hair, in 3 cases, still existed in boxes their mothers had kept. Bree Vickery was exhumed in June. Bone and nail confirmed what the braid had already said. Lucian Sackville had been in the ground for 29 years, and thallium, which is the reason it was ever called the poisoner's poison, does not leave. It stays in bone. They found him in the 4th week of July. Monty Sackville lasted 9 days before he gave a proffer, and then gave the state 4 hours of testimony about 940 recertifications and the 4 occasions on which his mother had told him, in different words, that some children were simply born to be looked after. He pled to fraud counts and testified. He will be 61 when he gets out. Alban Pelham surrendered his medical license in August, rather than face the board, and was indicted in October, and died of a stroke in his own kitchen the following spring, which several people in Cortland Hollow described as a mercy, and which Sorrel Tennyson, publicly and on the record, described as a robbery. Detective Ophelia Ketchum apologized to Oren Vickery in the hallway outside courtroom 2. She did it properly, without qualifiers, and he shook her hand, and he told her the truth, which was that she had done her job exactly right, and that if she had assumed anything about him on day 1, his daughter would have been sent home to Kell Street. Loretta Sackville never confessed. She sat through 11 days of trial with her chin up. When the verdicts came back, she looked at the jury with an expression of enormous patience, as though they were children who would understand later. She is 71 now. She will not be released. Mira Vickery walked without a cane 14 months after the night she couldn't stand up in her own hallway. It took 8 months of therapy, 2 surgeries she didn't need but that a well-meaning specialist talked them into, and a physical therapist named Ruthie who let her bring the spiral notebook to every session. The notebook is still called Things That Are Actually True. There is an entry, in a 9-year-old's handwriting, that Oren photographed and keeps on his phone. Grown-ups can be nice on the outside all the way through and still be the bad thing. Dad says that's the whole reason you check. The Copper Ribbon Fund was dissolved by the state attorney general in the spring, and its remaining assets, a little over $400,000, most of it raised at bake sales by people who meant every dollar of it, were distributed to 7 surviving former residents of Sackville House. Sorrel Tennyson used hers to finish a nursing degree. She works in a pediatric unit in Louisville. She is, by every account, terrifying about medication logs. The white Victorian on Kell Street sold at auction. The hand-painted bottle green sign came down in November, and a man from the county took the banner poles out of the town square with a socket wrench, while about 40 people watched and nobody said anything. Oren Vickery still runs the converted feed store on the edge of Cortland Hollow. The brick got replaced with better glass. He kept the spray-painted roll-up door for 8 months and then painted it himself, on a Saturday, with his daughter sitting on an overturned bucket, telling him he was going outside the lines. He does more expert witness work now than he used to. Twice a year he drives to Indianapolis and gives a lecture to third-year medical residents at Belrose, at Dr. Boateng's invitation. It's 40 minutes long. It has 1 slide of a graph with 28 bars on it, and 1 photograph of a green mug, and he opens it the same way every time. Everything that gets into a body leaves a roadmap, he tells them. The trick isn't being smart. The trick is being willing to sample the place nobody wants you to sample. So here's what I keep turning over about this one. We talk a lot on this channel about people who hide what they are. Loretta Sackville didn't hide. That's the part that got me. She stood in the middle of that town for 31 years in full view, with a banner and a bake sale and a ribbon on her coat. And the reason nobody caught her wasn't that she was clever. It's that she made herself expensive to suspect. Every year she added another photograph, another grieving mother who'd been helped, another person who would have to be wrong about her. She built a wall out of other people's gratitude, and then she stood behind it and did whatever she wanted. And the thing that finally came through that wall wasn't a confession, or a witness, or a deathbed letter. It was a centimeter of hair. Physics doesn't care how many casseroles you've made. A graph doesn't know you chaired the church council. That's what I find genuinely comforting about this story, and I want to leave you with it. The physical world keeps a record whether anyone believes you or not. Bree Vickery's braid sat in a hat box in a closet for 2 years, while an entire town told her husband she'd died of bad luck, and the whole time it was sitting there holding the answer, patiently, waiting for one person to think to ask it a question. The other thing, Sorrel Tennyson told people for 14 years, starting at 8 years old, and every adult she told explained to her that she was confused because she was sick. 14 years. If a kid ever tells you something about an adult that doesn't fit the adult you think you know, the correct move is not to reassure them. The correct move is to write down what they said, with the date on it, and keep it. That costs you nothing. It cost Sorrel Tennyson her legs. And Oren. He didn't get loud. He got specific. He was accused of poisoning his own child. His town burned him down, and he sat on a motel bed and wrote 4 questions at the top of a legal pad. In order, because the order is the discipline. That's the whole lesson. Rage is fast and it feels like doing something. Method is slow and it's the only thing that ever actually arrives. Drink it all, lamb, she used to say. All the way to the bottom, or it doesn't work. Turned out that was true about the evidence too. I'm Nathan. Thanks for sitting with me on this one. If it got to you, tell me in the comments what you'd have sampled first, because I've got a feeling half of you would have gone straight for that mug. See you in the next one.